Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. And welcome. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the Academy, and welcome to tonight's Nina Maria Gorson lecture. A thing or two has happened since we last met, and I will only say about that I am glad we are here together doing the work of the Academy. And in some ways, since tonight's lecture is entitled Youth Politics and the Downfall of the Brazilian Military Dictatorship, it's, as they would say in German, zutreffend, it's appropriate, because political action is something we need to learn more about. And I also believe strongly that however awful it is outside, the work of scholarship and art goes on, and that's what we are here about. So I'm really thrilled to have you here. We are also pleased that we are once more part of the Berlin Science Week with this event, and I know that there are scientists all over town tuning in. So about our Nina Maria Gorson Fellowship, this one is important to us. They all are, but this one's especially important. Nina Maria Gorson, whose married name was Nina Maria von Malzahn, was one of the granddaughters of Hans Arnold. She grew up in New York after her parents had to flee the Nazis. She studied in Switzerland, and she later married Lothar von Malzahn in 1990, and we're sorry that he couldn't be here tonight. Her philanthropic interests were wide, and her commitment was extraordinarily deep. She was the longtime chair of the board of the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. She perhaps was most passionate about a school with a whole association of social services that she created in Uruguay for underprivileged children. And here in Berlin, she was one of our closest friends and most devoted trustees. And she passed away just a couple of years ago, and it was an enormous loss for all of us. This fellowship was inaugurated in 2011. It is a fellowship specifically in history, and it is granted to two outstanding scholars every academic year. I'm now looking at some of the great scholars who were here recently and realizing that one of them was a political scientist. Oops. But he was a very historically oriented political scientist, Noam Lupu, Mariana Candido, and Johan Elverskog, who was one of my very favorite fellows, because unusually here at the Academy, he was the world's foremost historian of the Uyghurs, especially in their medieval period when they were Buddhists. Anyway, so the scholars, the fellowship has a really interesting and distinguished history, and as befitted Nina herself. So this semester's fellow is James Green, the Carlos Manuel de Cespedes. Those foreign languages kill me. Professor Emeritus of Modern Latin American History and Professor Emeritus of Portuguese and Brazilian Studies at Brown, where he was just granted emeritus status this past summer. Tonight, Jim will give us a deeper insight into Brazil, the largest democracy in Latin America, and we're thrilled that it is a democracy. Jim Green earned degrees in Latin American history from California State and UCLA, where he received his PhD, and his work, his dissertation was entitled Beyond Carnival, Male Homosexuality in 20th Century Brazil. In addition to homosexuality, his other main topic of research has been resistance to the military dictatorship that ruled Brazil from 1964 to 1985. He has published 11 books. It's a lot of books, and co-edited various special issues of academic journals on Brazil. I'm always reminded of John Updike's quip that being prolific was a 19th century virtue and a 20th century vice, but I'm very impressed by that. Jim's works Beyond Carnival and We Cannot Be Silent have been made into documentary movies, and another one on gay rights activists will soon be a feature film. His career, after being deeply involved in the protest movement against Vietnam, he became interested in Latin America and became involved in the movement against the Brazilian military dictatorship. He was based in America in the early 70s. And then he traveled through Central America and finally settled in Brazil in 1976, staying there until 1982 as an English teacher. And this is also when he became active and founded the first gay rights organization in Brazil. And then he came back to the US and studied Latin America at UCLA. I think you can see just from that brief bio that Jim is a truly engaged public historian and has been deeply involved in speaking out against human rights abuses and advocating for homosexual rights in Brazil. He is the national coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil and the founder and director of the Washington Brazil office, an independent think tank supporting actions that strengthen the role of civil society, and is dedicated to the promotion and defense of democracy, human rights, freedoms, and sustainable socioeconomic and environmental development in Brazil. Jim has been president of the Brazilian Studies Association and director of the Brown Brazil Initiative. He has received the Brazilian Ministry of Justice Amnesty Commission Award for the defense of LGBTQ rights during the dictatorship. And he received that award in 2015. And in 2019, he was the recipient of a Distinguished Brown Research Achievement Award. Jim is also something of a recidivist. He's been a fellow here, you could say before. He was a remote fellow in the COVID-blighted year of 2020, just as I was getting started. And he is one of two such fellows we have here. Is Ayana here? Yes, there she is. So we're thrilled that he this time has made it to the Wannsee and is making the most of his time here. During his stay, Jim is working on a new project entitled The Crossroads of Sin and the Collision of Culture. Well, it's the new one now. So you're going to hear about what he's working on now. The other one, heads will roll for this. Okay. Probably mine. Tonight, anyway, we're going to hear about what he has, his own experiences and what he's learned about the military dictatorship and Brazilian history more broadly. This will last about 35 minutes, after which I will join Jim up there and we'll have a conversation that we will open up to the audience. If you're here, you know how to ask a question. And if you're not here, press that the Q&A box in the platform after accepting the pop-up. So, sir, only one grievous error in that introduction. It's all yours.
Ready to go. Daniel, thank you very much for that generous introduction. And I would like to thank the American Academy in Berlin for this fellowship. The warm, friendly, and attentive staff and my cohort of fellows have been amazing. And I'm also grateful to those who endowed the Nina Maria Grorson Fellowship. This has been truly a memorable and incredibly productive semester. I can't think of a worse moment to give this presentation, although indirectly it speaks to the horrible period that we are about to begin. I'm not sure if my talk will make sense in this climate, but I didn't have the mental energy yesterday to rewrite it, so here goes. So, what's the plan for this evening? I will begin with a brief overview of the recent events in Brazil that have led to a polarization in the country not unlike the one we are experiencing in the United States and in other parts of the world. I will then answer the question that everyone asks: how did you get so passionate about Brazil? With a quick overview of my personal, political, and academic biographies. This will be followed by a concise history of the dictatorship from the 1960s until the late 1970s. I will then talk about my research project, Generation 77, and finally, I will see how the discussions of the 1970s are still playing out today. So let's begin. In 2002, in his fourth presidential campaign, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, commonly known as Lula, a former trade union leader and the founder of the mass-based left-wing Workers' Party, was elected president. His first 2 terms in office were marked by a series of successful social welfare, educational, and other programs to transform the country and address the stark gap between the rich and the poor. Lula's projection on the world political stage also addressed a long-term aspiration of Brazil to become a global player, if not a world power. Despite legal claims of influence peddling and legislative vote buying by close staff, Lula won. He was reelected in 2006 and left office in 2010 with an 87% approval rating. He was so popular that he was able to handpick his successor, Dilma Rousseff, a former guerrilla fighter who was Lula's Minister of Mines and Energy and later his Chief of Staff. During Dilma Rousseff's first term, from 2011 to 2014, the economy faltered in a delayed response to the 2008-9 worldwide economic crisis, and many considered her responses ineffective. In 2013, in reaction to police repression of protests against bus fare hikes in São Paulo, thousands took to the streets in that city and around the country. The demonstrations at first demanded that instead of investing in the new stadiums for the 2014 World Soccer Cup, hosted by Brazil, the government should spend more on health, education, and public transportation. However, as the mobilizations increased in size, right-wing organizations perceived that the protests actually criticized the government. They joined the mobilizations, transforming them into demonstrations against the Rousseff administration. Nevertheless, Rousseff was reelected in 2014 by a close vote, with her main right-wing opponent making unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud. Familiar. At the same time, Sérgio Moro, a prosecuting judge, began an investigation known as Operation Car Wash into money laundering and kickback schemes by high-ranking officials in Petrobras, the state-owned oil company. Members of the Workers' Party were suspected of being involved. Moreover, former President Lula was accused of receiving an apartment from a company with government contracts, among other charges. And I apologize to the Brazilians in the audience that I'm oversimplifying everything tonight because, we have to do that for an audience that doesn't know a lot about Brazil. Sensing the vulnerability of Rousseff's presidency, and with the collusion of Vice President Michel Temer, who was part of the Workers' Party governing coalition, the right wing began a campaign to oust Rousseff from power. Again, oversimplifying. They charged her with irregular budgetary operations, basically moving around government funds and expenditures to guarantee a balanced annual budget as required by law. In the impeachment vote in the Chamber of Deputies, Jair Bolsonaro, a former army captain and a relatively insignificant member of Congress representing Rio de Janeiro, dedicated his impeachment vote to the military dictatorship that ruled the country from 1964 to 85, and to the colonel who had overseen Rousseff's torture when she was a political prisoner in 1970. As soon as Rousseff was impeached, but before she was convicted, Temer assumed office, according to Brazilian law, and began a conservative backlash. Among other measures, he appointed a white, all-male cabinet dismantled labor protection, abolished the Ministry of Culture, and froze new budgetary expenses beyond inflation for 2 decades. The next year, 2017, Lula was sentenced to 13 years in prison, and instead of asking for political asylum, as some of his allies counseled him to do, he insisted on his innocence and spent 580 days in jail. Although polls showed him leading in the upcoming 2018 presidential elections, he was barred from running for office. Another difference between Brazil and the United States. Fernando Haddad, Lula's former Minister of Education and ex-mayor of São Paulo, became the Workers' Party candidate, eventually running against Jair Bolsonaro, who soared in the polls after a failed assassination attempt gained him significant sympathy. As if they're copying, it's like... In October 2018, Bolsonaro won in the runoff against Haddad. The international press began to call him the Trump of the tropics because his policies and tone were so reminiscent of those of the US president. And so on December 1st, 2018, 200 activists, scholars of Brazil working in the United States, and Brazilian immigrants who had been involved in social movements and the left in Brazil gathered at Columbia University Law School to found the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. Over the next 4 years, members of the network carried out over 1,000 different actions and events against the Bolsonaro government, among them protests in New York City when the U.S.-Brazil Chamber of Commerce decided to declare Bolsonaro the Man of the Year. And then there was a whole shaming of him, and he ended up not receiving the award in New York City. And over the course of the 4 years, many times these images were projected, or other images were projected on buildings in New York. At the New York meeting, the body also approved the formation of the Washington Brazil office, designed to be an advocacy organization, progressive think tank, and vehicle for the international articulation of Brazilian social movements. Now, I will spare you the details of the Bolsonaro presidency, but as a person who has been engaged in solidarity with Brazil for decades, for the first time, it was easy to talk about Brazil to people in the United States who had little knowledge of the country. The phrase, the Trump of the tropics, stuck. People quickly understood the comparisons and similarities between the two presidents. Bolsonaro's policies on COVID-19, refusing to wear a mask, denying its impact, and questioning the vaccines, resulted in over 600,000 deaths on all fronts, from deforestation of the Amazon, illegal mining, invasion of indigenous territories, attacking LGBTQ rights, denigrating women, racist comments. I could go on. Trump and Bolsonaro seem to be like identical twins. In 2021, the Brazilian Supreme Court released Lula from jail, and overturned the convictions against him based on legal technicalities. Although not directly part of the reasons for Lula's release, hacked phone messages between the judge and the prosecuting attorney revealed an egregious collaboration during Lula's trial. And after Lula was sent to jail, Bolsonaro appointed the judge, Sérgio Moro, to be the Minister of Justice. With convictions against him overturned in 2022, Lula once again ran for the presidency against Bolsonaro. Throughout the campaign, polls showed Lula ahead. In response, Bolsonaro illegally mobilized the state apparatus to favor his reelection and claimed that Brazil's electronic voting system, one of the best in the world, was flawed. He also threatened a coup should he lose the election. In this regard, the Biden administration, in post-January 6th environment, was outstanding in supporting democracy in Brazil. It sent a clear message that the U.S. government would oppose any attempted coup by the Brazilian military. And this was in stark departure from the early 1960s, when the Kennedy and Johnson administrations supported the 1964 military takeover and backed the generals who took power. And I write about this in detail in an article, A Tale of Two Coups, in the Academy's Berlin Journal, if you're more interested in that topic. The Washington Brazil office aided this effort by bringing representatives from 20 social movements to Washington to talk to the Congress, White House, State Department, and the Organization of American States about the threat to Brazilian democracy. This delegation was crucial in gathering support in the U.S. Senate, which echoed the Biden administration's positions and voted unanimously to block aid to Brazil should the armed forces attempt a coup d'etat. In October 22, Lula defeated Bolsonaro 51-49. Bolsonaro's supporters called on the military to intervene and camped out in front of army barricades throughout the country. On January 1st, 2003, Lula was inaugurated president in this amazing ceremony with representatives of the people of Brazil accompanying him up the official ramp into the presidential palace. A week later, Bolsonaro's supporters invaded the seats of the three branches of government in Brasilia in a rerun of January 6, 2021. Their intent was to provoke a crisis that would allow the military to intervene, claim political chaos, and assume power with or without Bolsonaro. While many rioters have been charged and Bolsonaro has lost his right to run for office until 2030, the far right is still very alive and well in Brazil, working with CPAC, Steve Bannon, and others. Not a hopeful sign. Now to the question, why Brazil? I was raised in a progressive Quaker milieu, which meant being a pacifist, a supporter of civil rights, and an active opponent of the war in Vietnam. After finishing college in 1972, I joined 7 other young Quakers to live in a commune in Philadelphia. We had a weekly study group on Latin America with the idea of engaging in international solidarity with progressive movements throughout the continent. Each person had to present a presentation on a country. I chose Brazil. Knowing almost nothing about Brazil, I started reading about what was available in English, which was not very much at the time. I also tracked down an organization in Washington, D.C., the Committee Against Repression in Brazil, CARIB. It was founded by Marcos Arruda, a Brazilian student activist and former political prisoner who had been horribly tortured after his arrest in 1970. His family managed to get him out of prison and then out of the country in 1971. That same year, CARIB organized a protest against Brazilian dictator, President Médici, during his visit to the Nixon White House. And I began working with Marcos in 2023. It's another picture of the hippie. And I began working with Marcos in 1973. And this was a protest in front of the Brazilian embassy in Washington, D.C. on September 7th, 1973, which is Brazilian Independence Day, demanding explanations about the ongoing torture of political prisoners in Brazil. Decades later, Marcos's mother published a book about her son's imprisonment. We translated and expanded her work in an English edition published by Duke University Press. Marcos' story is the basis for the opera that I have created and which I have been working on in my off hours here at the Academy, and I will dedicate or recognize the Academy for that support at some point in the future. In 1973, I also came out and became active in what today is called the LGBTQ plus movement. In addition, after September 11th, 1973, and the coup in Chile, I was a founding member of the Chile Solidarity Movement in Philadelphia. Moving to San Francisco in 74, I joined the June 28th Union, a gay socialist collective. And among our activities, we organized an evening of gay solidarity with the Chilean resistance, attended by 300 LGBT people from San Francisco. In 1976, I began my journey through Central America to Colombia, down the Amazon River, along the Atlantic coast to Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. My intention was to stay in Brazil for 6 months. I stayed 6 years. In São Paulo, I joined the Socialist Convergence, which was a left-wing semi-clandestine organization, and founded a gay and lesbian caucus, which was the first of its kind in a political party in Latin America. And at the same time, I was a founding member of Somos Homosexual Affirmation Group, the first Brazilian LGBT organization that was political. I became the leader of its left wing. And in 1980, we organized 50 gay and lesbian activists who joined a May Day demonstration in solidarity with the striking metal workers. Its leader, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and others were in prison for violating the National Security Act. Returning to the United States in 82, I was involved in community, labor, and immigrant rights advocacy while working as a bilingual social worker for the County of Los Angeles. And then in 1982, I enrolled in the graduate history program at UCLA, basically on the advice of someone of how to get back to Brazil was through academic luxury and privileges. And I wrote a dissertation, which is mentioned, became my first book, Beyond Carnival, which is now in its third revised and expanded Portuguese language edition. And we're working on the documentary. It's going to be an 8-episode series for Brazilian TV, but it's not out yet. We're still raising money for it. Beyond Carnival is a social history arguing that Carnival celebrations offered a moment of freedom for people with non-normative gender identities and sexual desires, but until a politicized movement emerged in the 1970s, society was almost universally hostile to same-sex sexuality and dissident gender performances. My second book, We Cannot Remain Silent, Opposition to the Brazilian Military Dictatorship in the United States, documents the history of the movement in solidarity with Brazil, led by clergy, academics, returned volunteers, and a handful of Brazilians living in the US during the 1960s and 70s, which had an impact on pressuring the military regime to move towards democratization in the 1980s. My third book, Exile Within Exiles, Herbert Daniel, Gay Brazilian Revolutionary, is a biography of a medical student who joined the armed opposition to the military regime, repressing his homosexual desires during the 5 years he operated underground. Later, after returning from European exile, he became an important AIDS activist before dying in 1992. And I've also published a collection of essays in Portuguese with a provocative title, Writings of a Red Faggot, Escritos de um Viado Vermelho, which is very strong in Portuguese, Politics, Sexuality, and Solidarity. These works and others reflect my multiple identities as an historian, left-wing social democrat, LGBT activist, and a person deeply linked to Brazil. They address the long-term battle that I've had with sectors of the Brazilian left about latent homo, lesbo, transphobia, and simplistic Marxist-inflected criticisms of what some call identity politics. And I shall return to this item later in my talk. Now to Brazilian history. On March 31st, 1964, the Brazilian armed forces overthrew the government of João Goulart, who had assumed the presidency in 1961 after President Jânio Quadros suddenly resigned. Goulart was a left-wing nationalist, a large-scale rancher, and a leader of the Brazilian Labor Party. In the context of the Cold War and in the aftermath of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, U.S. policymakers considered Brazil ripe for a socialist revolution and supported a broad coalition of the Catholic Church, entrepreneurs, sectors of the middle classes, and the armed forces to overthrow Goulart. Claiming to clean house of alleged communists, corruption, and runaway inflation, the military promised to restore order and morality and defend the Christian family. This was the 9th such military maneuver since the armed forces overthrew Emperor Pedro II in 1889 and proclaimed a republic. However, instead of briefly remaining in power, the military stayed for 21 years. They purged Congress and took away political rights of prominent figures. To retain support among the middle classes and their U.S. backers, the military preserved vestiges of formal democracy, keeping the Congress open most of the time, holding periodic elections, and establishing a pro-military party, Arena, and an opposition political party, the Brazilian Democratic Movement. However, whenever the opposition grew in strength, the military changed the rules of the game by decree to stay in power. In spite of a wave of about 20,000 arrests in the aftermath of the coup in 1964, the following year, a semi-clandestine student movement and left-wing intellectuals, artists, and political figures gradually began organizing against the dictatorship. The apogee of these mobilizations was in 1968, when the assassination of a student protester led to nationwide mobilizations. Concurrently, labor unions waged wildcat strikes. Students tried to reorganize their underground national student organization. Politicians spoke out about government repression and the use of torture against the opposition. At the same time, a small percentage of radicalized students, inspired by the Chinese and Cuban revolutions, began organizing guerrilla groups designed to topple the dictatorship, which among others included Herbert Daniel and his colleague Dilma Rousseff. Given the widespread opposition, on December 13, 1968, the military issued a decree that closed Congress, eliminated all civil liberties, expanded censorship, and gave a green light to torture as an official state practice. Over the next 4 years, over 2 dozen armed struggle organizations formed. They expropriated banks and seized weapons to jumpstart a rural guerrilla movement. They also kidnapped the US, German, and Swiss ambassadors and the Japanese consul to obtain the release of 130 political prisoners languishing in Brazilian jails. However, by 1974, the military had managed to crush all guerrilla organizations. While the radical left was being repressed between 1968 and 73 due to increased foreign investment and the prohibition of strikes, among other factors, the Brazilian economy grew a record 11% a year, consolidating support among sectors of the middle classes. However, the 1973-74 international oil crisis hit Brazil hard. With few oil reserves, the state had to buy oil abroad, producing a huge foreign debt and significant inflation, which undercut the military's popular support. Always concerned about the appearance of legality, the armed forces insisted on rotating four-star generals in the presidency. However, following the traditional electoral cycles, and they alternated that, but they wanted to appear that they were really following kind of a ritual of democracy. However, the president was chosen by the generals and then ratified by state legislatures who were supporting the government because the government channeled special resources to them. Thus, the opposition was surprised when Ernesto Geisel, the fourth four-star general to assume the presidency in March 1974, promised in August of that year that he was going to implement a slow, gradual, and secure liberalization, distinção. Geisel understood that the mounting economic crisis, in part due to the sharp rise in oil prices and a growing opposition among sectors of the middle classes, required that the military have a safe exit strategy to avoid a political rupture. Otherwise, there was the possibility of social upheaval, as had happened in Portugal with an April 1974 Carnation Revolution that overthrew the fascist dictatorship. Now, the surprise victory of the Brazilian Democratic Movement, the opposition party, in the November 1974 congressional elections marked the beginning of a shift of the balance of power between the regime and the opposition. Among the many factors that moved public sentiment against the ruling generals were the end of significant economic growth, increased inflation, a growing foreign debt, and middle-class fatigue with the regime's authoritarian and arbitrary measures. Geisel tried to manage the liberalization process through the controlled end to censorship beginning in 1975 and the symbolic marginalization of sectors of the hard right within the armed forces, especially after the staged suicide of a prominent journalist, Vladimir Herzog, in 1975, and a communist worker, Manuel Fiel Filho, in 1976. And as always, the military changed the rules of the game to stay in power, as they did in April 77, when the government closed Congress and decreed an electoral package that packed the Senate with pro-government politicians and weakened the opposition's electoral strength in urban areas. The pace of liberalization, however, remained a tug-of-war between the government and the legal opposition, in which unexpected events upset the rhythm of the process and the terms of engagement. So in April of 1977, several members of the Liga Operária, the Workers' League, a small Trotskyist group, were arrested when leafleting in the greater São Paulo region, calling for workers to demand wage hikes to keep up with inflation and participate in celebrations of May Day. The São Paulo student movement, which in the previous 3 years had been organizing carefully orchestrated protests against the regime inside the University of São Paulo campus, and the University of São Paulo was the most important university at the time, arguably, they mobilized in support of the detained and tortured students. These mobilizations culminated in a massive demonstration in downtown São Paulo on May 5th, 1977, the largest public protest since 1968. And for full disclosure, I'm somewhere in this march. I don't really know where, but I was there. And I'll tell another story. Someone looked up to me and said, "Porra, até gringos temos aqui contra a ditadura." Damn, we even have gringos here against the dictatorship, because I had a very thick accent at the time. The next year, employees from the Scania Saab automobile factory reported to work and then sat down at their machines, igniting a wildcat strike that turned into a 3-year nationwide wave of working class mobilizations. They defied the dictatorship's labor and economic policies and catapulted Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva to national prominence. Now, hundreds of books have been written in Brazil about the generation of 1968, especially about or by those who were engaged in the armed struggle, and it's also connected to 68 as a global phenomenon. However, little has been written about what I call Generation 77. Now, in thinking about Generation 77 in relationship to the mobilizations that took place in a specific moment of the late 1970s in Brazil, I am using Karl Mannheim's classical definition of a generation as a group of people significantly influenced by a given socio-historical environment and especially notable events in their youth, which involved them actively creating social cohorts with a shared experience and offering the possibility of shaping future generations. In this regard, assigning the year 1977 to a new generation of politicized students and youth is somewhat arbitrary, but the fact that the youth conquered the streets that year under the banner calling for democratic liberties, I argue, represented the core impulse of this generation, opposition to the authoritarian regime and a desire for expanded freedom. At the same time, and in the context of the liberalization process, new feminist, Black consciousness, and LGBT groups emerged. They largely embraced the banner of fighting for broad notions of democracy in articulations that insisted on rethinking traditional left-wing perspectives defended by clandestine student-based groups about the kind of Brazil that should exist with the end of the dictatorship. And to offer one example of this process, in February 1979, a left-wing student organization in the social science department of the University of São Paulo organized a set of 4 debates on what was called minorities, erroneous term, but that was the term used, with representatives of the women's, Black, and LGBT movements and indigenous movements, but actually the only people on the indigenous debate were anthropologists talking about indigenous people at the time. Keep in mind that the revived women's movement had only originally grown nationally in 1975. There's a long history of feminism in Brazil. I'm not trying to discount here, but it organized around the United Nations International Women's Year. And the United Black movement and the homosexual movement, as it was called at the time, only took shape in 1978. And as I mentioned, the indigenous movement was still nascent in São Paulo. On the evening that addressed the LGBT movement, a heated debate took place following the exposition of the panelists that pitted 2 clearly articulated and divergent political viewpoints against each other. One argued, by supporters of different left-wing student groups, held that the demands of the homosexual movement were controversial and raising them divided progressive forces. Therefore, they should be set aside for some future date so that a broad united front against the dictatorship could be forged. Members of Somos, the group that I was a part of, insisted that the repression of homosexuality was an immediate priority for those facing discrimination, and it was a failure of the left when it refused to take the demands of the LGBT movement seriously. And a third position, which was my position in this debate, less articulated at the time, put forward the need to combine the struggles against the dictatorship with the democratic demands of the women's, Black, and homosexual movements. This became an ongoing discussion between the Marxist left, which had significant influence in the opposition to the dictatorship, and the feminist and Black movements, and I shall return to this point in a few minutes. These debates notwithstanding, as Mannheim points out, it is the participation in a common sense of destiny that binds the generation together. Here it was the feeling that the days of the dictatorship were numbered, that represented a generational ethos. The members of Generation 77 sensed their participation in different groups and movements was linked to the feeling that something new was taking place in Brazil and that they were integral agents in that process. Mannheim notes that there is usually an intermediate or buffer generation between 2 discrete cohorts that contributes to the distinctiveness of each generation. In this case, I hypothesize that the years between 69 and 73 marked that intermediate period between 2 unique and different generations. It was a time frame in which left-wing oppositionists participated in semi-clandestine activities on Brazilian campuses to reorganize the student movement. Militants of the underground Brazilian Communist Party redirected their efforts to operate through the legal opposition and the Brazilian Democratic Movement, and left-wing intellectuals founded what were called alternative press as a public vehicle, or newspapers, alternative newspapers, as a public vehicle of debate about how to defeat the dictatorship. Historian Ken Serbin reminds us that after 1968, the first significant public demonstration against the dictatorship took place in downtown Sao Paulo in 1973, when several thousand students and others gathered at the Praça da Sé Cathedral for a mass honoring slain student and revolutionary Alexandre Leme. This was 2 years prior to the much larger ecumenical service held at the same site, memorializing journalist Vladimir Herzog after his assassination while under police custody. Still, despite this resistance, confined to a protective interior of the city's cathedral, the opposition was still on the defensive. Now, the geographical focus of my book will be on Sao Paulo. Highly conscious of the vast size and complexity of Brazil and the ongoing danger of falling into a trap of making Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo a stand-in or stand-ins for Brazil, nevertheless, despite the national scope of the student and politicized youth movement in '68, its core was Rio de Janeiro. By 1977, the center of gravity had shifted to Sao Paulo for myriad reasons too complex to outline here. But the process of the late 1970s took place throughout Brazil. However, the tone and pace were set by activities in the nation's largest metropolis. Generation 77 will have 7 main chapters, each featuring an individual who represents one of the many constituent student groups or new social movements made up of politicized and largely white middle-class youth in the years surrounding 1977. They come from different social, economic, political, racial, gender, and other identities and backgrounds. Their life stories and that of 70 other people I'm interviewing will be the means to analyze and understand the nature of the different movements and political perspectives that marked the late 70s and the early 80s in Brazil. During this period, new ideas, ideologies, and approaches to social change dialogued and at the same time clashed with an array of Marxist worldviews that had dominating the thinking of the 1968 political activists and were still present among sectors of the left fighting against the regime. For example, Marxists argued that the main issues facing most Brazilians was based on class and not race, ethnicity, gender identity, or sexual orientation. They defended the idea that Brazil was a racial democracy rather than a country organized around racial hierarchies. Important sectors of the left criticized the feminist movement, arguing, for example, that discussing violence against women or the defense of the right to abortion, which is illegal, still illegal in Brazil with certain exceptions, would alienate evangelical Christians and Catholics, who should be part of the left's base of support. They insisted similarly that raising the LGBT issues would turn off voters and lose elections. And in this regard, I'm interested in answering, among other things, the following questions. What were the processes that led to the emergence of what some scholars have called new social movements in the 1970s, and why did people join them? What was the nature of the content of the debates between the traditional Marxist left and the new ideas presented by feminist, Black, and LGBT movements? In what ways did the different visions of how to build a broad democratic movement against the dictatorship affect these new articulations by Sao Paulo youth? And to what extent are these discussions still relevant? Regarding the last point, during the Bolsonaro government, there was an important discussion about how best to defeat his electoral aspirations. Lula argued for an extremely broad coalition that included inviting Geraldo Alckmin, a former governor of Sao Paulo, to be Lula's vice presidential running mate. Alckmin had run against Lula and Rousseff for the presidency, representing an important center-right party, so he was a former opponent of Lula's that became his vice presidential candidate. This broad front strategy in many ways was similar to Harris's campaign's gestures to Lynn Cheney and other Republicans. And in the aftermath of the victory of Trump, a major question will be what the Democrats did wrong and what will be the best strategy to defeat Trump's policies and those of the proto-fascist Republican Party. Let me offer an example of a fake campaign ad used during the 2018 Brazilian presidential campaign. Over time, the Workers' Party and the Party of Socialism and Liberty, to its left, had largely supported the LGBT movement's agenda. During the 2018 campaign, Bolsonaro's supporters circulated this image on the internet, arguing that Haddad, who had been mayor of Sao Paulo, had distributed baby bottles to Sao Paulo daycare centers to promote homosexuality. And this was believed by millions of people. Although, as I mentioned, the Workers' Party had embraced LGBT issues, the question really becomes how visible the left is willing to be in defending the movement's agenda. Some sectors of the left are still reluctant to raise what are considered controversial issues that might estrange voters from the Workers' Party. The questions remain: what kind of broad front do we organize against the extreme right? What is its agenda and program? And what stays in and what is left out? This issue is also prominent in criticisms of identity politics. I put that in quotes. On one hand, sectors of the Brazilian left insist on organizing the poor and working class based on their identity as workers, yet it dismisses other ways that working class people might understand themselves and create alternative identities. There remains a reluctance for important political forces to be open and honest in their discussions about the nature of democracy that we want to enjoy and the best ways to defend it. Now, to a certain extent, this debate skirts addressing fundamental issues, such as the fact that Brazil was built on the genocide of the indigenous people, how the elaboration of the ideology of racism justified slavery, the hierarchical and exclusionary nature of gender constructions, and limited notions about the nature of democracy. How do we speak to a broad public without abandoning values and democratic ideals, such as equality, which we defend? This is obviously not just an issue facing Brazil or the United States. We are in a worldwide conflict with extremist ideologies on the right that mobilize religious beliefs, nationalism, xenophobia, and conservative notions of gender, the family, and society in a nostalgic rereading of the past. In the case of Brazil, the military dictatorship. In part, it is a response to the economic reorganization of the global north, which has gutted many industries and sectors of the economy that in the past gave certain working class people a relatively high standard of living. In part, the rise of the extreme right is a reaction to the democratic wave of the last 60 years that has challenged racism, sexism, and homo, lesbo, transphobia, and other issues, and fought for their inclusion. The left, understood broadly, is still in many ways defensive about its positions, given the popular support of the extreme right. And I think that in the next months, there's going to be even more defensiveness about what we did wrong or what they did wrong. One of the tasks ahead is to figure out how to truly defend democracy without succumbing to the pressures to abandon basic democratic values, positions, and causes. Thank you.
That was terrific.
Don't ask me about Sarah
I'm not going to ask you about the Sarah Bernhardt part. That was his last project.
Is this working now? Yeah, it's working. Okay. Yeah.
So a few introductory questions, if I might. I assume it's true for Brazil in the time period under discussion that it too was having a big youth wave, that it was having a demographic youth bulge, which was also, as we did in the U.S., and that was in fact a deep causal factor. And I was interested. It reminded me of Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, about all the ways that people on the same side can still find all kinds of things to fight about.
Or to kill each other about. Also.
Or to kill each other
That's
about.
what they did.
Yeah. Do you want to say a little more about the evolution of U.S. policy over this period?
So Brazil joined the United States in World War II as the only country of Latin America to actually send troops to the fronts. And they sent 25,000 troops to Italy and were involved in the campaigns. Fought poorly at first and then were very successful. In Monte Castillo, I think was the name of the important fighting. And this was very important. And it was ironic because the country was under an authoritarian regime that vacillated between supporting Germany or supporting the Allies. And eventually, after enough German U-boats sunk merchant Marines and other Brazilian boats, they sided with the Allies. In part, I think, because the Allies were winning a little bit. And so after that, the United States, which had already started influence after the turn of the 20th century, had a significant cultural influence in Hollywood and a lot of cultural transmission. And then in the 1950s, tremendous influence in the country, and especially the armed forces as well. So they trained the armed forces and advised them and were accompanying them. And the Kennedy and the Johnson administrations were very clear about the fear that Brazil would be another Cuban revolution. A lot of exaggerated, scaring kind of material came out of the New York Times about the possibility of a revolution in the northeast of Brazil. And this led the ambassador, a Harvard-educated Lincoln Gordon. I tell my students, just because you go to Harvard doesn't mean you're smart.
So you taught at Brown.
Yeah, that's what people at Brown say because we have an inferiority complex about Brown at Harvard. But he insisted that this was really going to be a frontier of the Cold War that needed to be stopped, and he was very proud of the fact that he helped support the overthrow. So the U.S. government supported the overthrow of the dictatorship, supported it. There was a beginning of opposition in Congress, but it was really only when Jimmy Carter came to power that the U.S. government shifted its policies towards Brazil. By that time, Brazil didn't feel it needed the U.S. government support. It was building multilateral relations, including with Germany, signed a nuclear agreement with Germany as a way of basically telling the United States, we don't depend on you. So this has engendered over the years a deep, strong, and justifiable anti-Americanism among large sectors of Brazilian society. At the same time, Brazilians love American culture and American ways. So this is very complex love-hate relationship between the two. And I think that you can see this in the way in which certain sectors were very skeptical when we organized our delegation to go to the United States because they saw the United States as a monolithic country and culture and political society. And we were able to show them that the Biden administration was absolutely 100% correct in their policies towards defending democracy. And because of his policies, the armed forces were split. The army did not come to a consensus about overthrowing Lula and said, the United States is not supporting us. We're not crazy enough to do that. They were already being discredited by their involvement in the Bolsonaro government. And the Navy also was split. The Air Force was gung-ho about supporting a possible coup. And as a result of that, democracy was preserved. And it was not largely, but it was a part of that was definitely Biden's policies. And we were able to reinforce that through the Congress and our other work. Although it was very much also the movement in Brazil of social movements organizing and defending democracy in the country. So the United States has a very complex relationship with Brazil, which, Lula endorsed Kamala, which I found amazing because it was just before the election and, she lost and
It didn't help.
But it was an important gesture. And in terms of Venezuela, where more recently, Lula, who saw Chavez's government as in a very favorable light, has distanced itself of the current government and questioning the election results, and did not invite Daniel Ortega and Nicaragua into the BRICS meeting that Brazil's a part of, blocked their coming in, which is kind of a signal, I think, that he is, on one hand, articulating with Russia and China and other countries, Iran and BRICS and other areas, but on the other hand, he wants to keep a door open to the United States.
So I don't want to monopolize the conversation with discussion of U.S.
We can
Brazilian relations, but U.S.-Brazilian relations have been, in the era of Cardozo, for example, were pretty warm. Clinton and Cardozo had a great relationship, and yet I can just say from personal experience, dealing with some Brazilian counterparts in the Obama years, incredibly challenging. And it just seems like the ingrained suspicion of the U.S. is just never going to be exercised.
It's really deep. And one of the curious things that I always wondered was why people didn't assume I was CIA. And I actually went recently, I'm interviewing for another book I'm working on, people who I work with politically. I said, how come you guys didn't think I was CIA? Did you ever talk about that? I said, no, we just thought you were so bizarre and so different. You couldn't possibly have been invented by the CIA because I was openly gay and all these kinds of things, which was very uncommon at the time. But there's a deep, deep distrust, and it's visceral, it's strong, and it's ingrained in the left. And so it's so hard. And I have friends here who are tonight, for example, I personally, not the Washington Brazil office, I personally am against the invasion of Ukraine. But there are long debates that happen about the role of NATO as a aggressive force that's trying to overturn and threaten Russia, and people, the United States government interested in getting oil, that really people believe in strongly. And it's built on this anger that they have about the fact the U.S. government supported the military. I have a project called Opening the Archives, which is digitized 70,000 U.S. government documents about Brazil and made them available on an open access website. And we have been working to declassify those documents through the normal channels, freedom of information and declassification processes. But we also wanted to see if we could get some hyper classified documents released in this last administration. And that didn't happen. In part because the Brazilian government, Lula, didn't really want to open that wound again and talk about 64, especially after the invasion of the government buildings on January 8th. I said, let's not talk about the anniversary of the coup, which was this year, the 60th anniversary. So there were no official celebrations by the state, in part to allay anger by the military, which is very, very anti-communist and very strong about that. And very pro-American. So.
A word on civil-military relations all these years after the coup?
It's been tricky. I mean, the governments after the military was left power finally got in the hands of a civilian, which was the head of over the armed forces, the Minister of Defense. Under Bolsonaro, reverted to a military figure, and I was honored to be invited to participate in the National Truth Commission, which investigated the crimes of periods, including the dictatorship, but actually a larger time frame. And the military was very hostile to that. They really didn't want any further discussion about the gross violation of human rights. And so in Brazil, there was a 1970 amnesty law passed, which meant that most political prisoners and exiles could return, except if they had been involved in what were called blood crimes, which meant someone was killed in a bank robbery or something. But all people connected in connected crimes, that is, the torturers, were amnestied. So to this day, no person in Brazil who violated human rights has ever been jailed or prosecuted. There have been 2 civil cases, but the person died before they were able to do a punishment, a civil fine against them. So there's been this amnesty that is an amnesia. That is, there's a forgetting of the past. And this has emboldened the military over the years to feel they really can do whatever they want to do because there'll be no punishment for it. And that's one of the big problems, I think, as one of the legacies of the dictatorship.
Well, I have plenty more questions, but I'm sure that the audience does as well. And so we're going to start. And Nell, because you're right in front, you get to go first.
Wait for the microphone.
Do wait for the mic, yeah.
I know that Peter is behind me and has another question. Well, I'll make a short statement, which is thank you so much. That was fascinating. And I found the images of people in the streets with their banners really inspiring. Thank you. The other thing, I'm from New Jersey, and my town of Newark has a very large Brazilian population. And the only time in my life I've ever seen a Bolsonaro bumper sticker was in Newark. And my impression is, just shopping in the Ironbound, that lots and lots of the owners and managers of the businesses are Brazilian. And I'm wondering how much call it overseas Brazilians in places like Newark affect what goes on in Brazil.
So there are about 1,800,000 Brazilians in the United States. Those are all guesstimates. I would imagine about half of them are undocumented. It's hard to get from Brazil to the United States. There are 2 ways to do it. You can oversend your stay by going to Disney World and then just disappearing or doing something like that, or crossing the Mexican border. But that's really, really horrible to do. It's really, you can die in the deserts. It's really difficult. And so most Brazilians who manage to come tend to be from the lower middle class or working class in some way. Entrepreneurs, some of them. They're not buying their way in? Well, I mean, you buy your way by, you get a round trip ticket, you get on a tour.
You mean over the border with?
Yeah, with coyotes. Yeah, you can get smuggled across the border also.
No. Isn't there a policy?
No, but you have to be really rich to do that.
Yeah,
it's a lot of
$500,000.
Yeah, but
like dollars. Yeah.
So in Miami, they're all over the country, but in Miami, there's a large expat invest in a Miami apartment. Bolsonaro, after the defeat in the elections, went to Miami. And the community is divided, and if we can base it on the very low electoral results, there people can vote in 10 electoral places in the consulates around the country. That Lula won in, I'm going to get it wrong, San Francisco, Los Angeles, almost won in New York, DC, and another city. I can't remember now. But Bolsonaro won the other places, and especially where there's large concentrations. So there's there are people who come conservative, the people who come and need a support network, and so they join an evangelical Christian church, which offers them tips on where you can get a job, support, emotional support. Their husband's drinking too much, you're going to get them to stop and love Jesus. And so that becomes a very important influence on large people. Danbury, Connecticut, for example, I'm talking about now 15 years ago, had 12 churches in downtown, 2 Catholic churches and 10 evangelical Christian Brazilian churches. 10 evangelical Christian churches. And it was everyone, you did that on Sunday because that's where you saw everyone and talked to people and found out about jobs and what's going on and how I can get this product that's been imported or what's happening in your family. And because of cluster migration also, there are a lot of people from the same areas that are together. The U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil, the Brazilians, because U.S. Citizens or no foreigners are allowed to participate in Brazilian elections in any way, they organize a campaign to mobilize people in support. And did a first national poll to figure out political ideology, and it's still conservative. It reflects that 49% that voted for Bolsonaro in the elections.
Just a follow-up point: the evangelical churches of Brazil were entirely or partially created by the American evangelical movement.
So that's a really interesting question. Fascinating. So there's the 19th century when Brazil allows foreign missionaries to come in in 1815 when they opened the ports. Long story, the traditional Protestant churches come. So Methodists and Episcopalian and Unitarians, etc. And they realize that the best way to grow is to go into the small towns and offer education. So the schools and then universities. And this becomes upward mobility and a notion of upward mobility that's really important. In the 20th century, the Seventh-day Adventists and the Assembly of God, especially the Assembly of God, starts out in the Amazon region of Belém do Pará and grows significantly. And in all these churches, and I've had several students that I've worked with who have done their dissertations, so that's why I know about all this, because I've read all these dissertations. They have an initial fight between the home church, which wants to maintain values, and if you're a Southern Baptist home church, how do you deal with the fact that Brazil is a multiracial society that doesn't have formal apartheid when you have formal apartheid in the United States? What do you deal with that? And so there's all these very interesting debates between the autonomy of the local pastors who become, converted and then become very strong, and then basically in all these denominations take over. The Lutheran Church splits during World War II because one sector of a large German population in the South supports the Axis, and then another sector is neutral and pro-Axis, and the people who are pro-Nazi basically, and there's a Nazi enclave in Brazil, they actually are put in jail and persecuted at some point in the Second World War. And then the evangelical Christians grow tremendously in the 60s and 70s, in part when there's a crisis within liberation theology, the progressive wing of the Catholic Church, and especially John Paul II, the Pope from Poland, who's very anti-communist and maneuvers to limit the power of the progressive wing of the Catholic Church, which is extremely important in the movement against the dictatorship, and does a whole bunch of maneuvering around that to weaken their influence. That lack of engagement means there's a part of a working class community that needs kind of emotional and spiritual and physical support, and the evangelical Christians go in and provide that kind of support network to them, and they become important in Brazil and not.
And these are Americans.
Sorry?
These are Americans.
No, these are,
these are
the Brazilians.
indigenous.
And in a working class neighborhood, there's 3 churches on every block. They're small, storefront churches, and the most important one is called the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, which was founded by a pastor who went to New York and in the 70s was watching in a hotel a televangelist asking for money and the credit cards were coming in. He said, what the hell is going on here? How does that happen? Who does this? Came back to Brazil and built $1 billion church, and it's Brazilian. And then they exported it around the world. All cities in the United States, major cities in the downtown areas where there are old movie houses that no longer function, have been turned into the churches of the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, which very weirdly in the first period was supporting Lula's government and then moved to the right and supported Bolsonaro very strongly. But they're Brazil-based. They only allow, when they evangelize outside of Brazil, in Latino communities, they only allow the Brazilians to be the bishops because they want to have control over it. And it's a huge cult. I mean, it's amazingly. And they built the Temple of Solomon in Sao Paulo, which is a 9-story block, like a big IKEA block, which has menorahs and Jewish symbolisms. And the pastor uses prayer shawl and things like that to claim a connection to the Old Testament. And unfortunately, a very strong part of the evangelical Christian movement is extremely pro-Zionist and an imagination of what Israel is, which has nothing to do with the real Israel. It's a kind of a way of claiming their lineage to the Old Testament. So Brazilians are extremely religious, not only in Christianity, but in Afro-Brazilian religions and indigenous spirituality and other beliefs. It's something I find amusing, but they're very religious too. And so religion is very important to people.
I think we need to have a field trip to accompany this talk.
It's amazing. And there's a big Igreja Universal in Berlin. And that, again, it's the thing, all these Brazilian immigrants who come to Europe to survive or cleaning houses or doing whatever they're doing to survive, they need a support network. They can't go to the state. The communities are not big enough and they haven't developed the infrastructure to provide mutual aid societies like other immigrant societies. So the churches do that, and that's why they became important.
Frank, you've been very patient.
I'm sorry.
Thanks a lot. That's really amazing. I've got 2 questions. First, a bit academic one. You use the concept of Karl Mannheim of the 1920s generation as an experience. So as far as I know the literature, it's always stressed that a generation is a construction to reach goals, so that you need a certain communication to claim that you are a generation and the future belongs to you. So my question is, when do they claim and how do they claim that they're a generation, or this is more a concept you are using? So when is the generation term coming in, picked up after the 68 movement? Maybe a second point, you're making a big picture with big groups on the slides, but very different groups. You just mentioned religious group, homosexual groups, indigenous people, black people, and so on. So it looks like a picture of harmony. I guess it was not. So can you tell a little bit of tensions between those kind of different groups, which were all against the dictatorship, of course?
So the first question I was going to answer, what was the first thing you said? Generation, yes. So yeah, I am coining a concept, which I predict in 2 or 3 years everyone's going to be using as the term for this period. Everyone I've interviewed loves the idea that they're being recognized as a generation. They see that, they understand that, they talk about that, but it's never been offered as an idea. And I don't know the history of different generations. I know about the generations in Latin America, generation of 1877, et cetera. But I don't know the details of how they actually self-constructed their notion of themselves. But I'm sure that happened in newspapers and talking about that. That's not happened here, although a very important historian of the dictatorship, I was just reading one of his works, and I opened a page and it said Generation 77. Shit, he took that term has been used. I'm not the first. I'm not coining it. Other people have used it, but no one's really made a point of making it. And so all the 7 people I interviewed, 2 have actually passed away. The other 5 people are alive. Are very happy because they feel very strongly that their generation was extremely different from '68. They made a difference. They weren't defeated. They were victorious because it led to democratization, although it was a rocky road with lots of ups and downs. And they're very proud of that. So I think this is a book that's gonna, I hope, maybe, will open a door to a debate, which is linked to my dilemma always as being North American, working on Brazil, living in Brazil, understanding the country, of how I could figure out to do academic production, which is not repetitive or derivative of Brazilian work, and kind of scamming and using it in the United States where people have less knowledge of the production in Brazil. I'm very sensitive to that, and my connections in Brazil are stronger perhaps than my connections in the American Academy, because I really don't want to play that game that some people do play. The second question about harmony and conflict. So the left was very, very politely hostile towards the Black movement, sectors of the women's movement, and the LGBT movement, in the way that Brazilians are very nice and polite when they're hostile. In really saying you're really dividing the movement, but it really was a code word for this is making me feel uncomfortable because I believe that Brazil is a racial democracy and you're questioning that, and that challenges everything I've learned since I was born about what my nation is. I'm very proud of that because the United States is racist. They had Jim Crow, they had apartheid, we didn't. And so it's a very important part of national identity to claim that the country is not a racial democracy. And the Black movement had a very difficult time. And there's a history here that I don't talk about in this presentation of people raising this question in the 30s or in the abolitionist movement, et cetera, challenging this notion. So that was very difficult at the time. And it was a rocky road in that regard. Brazil has another tradition which is very deep of social movements, peasant movements, labor movements, civil society movements. The Washington Brazil office, we have 78 civil society organizations affiliated to our office in Washington, D.C. Very mobilized, very active and engaged. And there are tensions. There's tensions around resources. There's tensions about visions. I think some of the movements are going through a very strong self-affirmation movement of deciding that only we are going to decide about our movement and you stay out. And some people can't understand that and don't criticize that or feel that's not legitimate. But it's inherently there, but there's a really richness. And what's one of the things that always fascinated me about Brazil, the richness of civil society and organization. And that's built on many things, including the way the Catholic Church in a progressive moment taught collective processes, the way a very important and famous educator, Paulo Freire, talked about conscientização, or how to teach literacy in a different way. And so there's a whole notion of process and thinking and working together, which is very important and different and very dynamic in Brazil.
Paula, since you were right next there, and I thought the microphone was still there.
Thank you so much for spelling out everything like this. It was fascinating, and I was wondering where are the missing links for three elements of the puzzle between the past and today. The first is gender. When I left Brazil in the 90s, I knew completely different gender relations that I met in Germany. We had a very progressive constitution on gender and family rights. In the university, the half of the professors were women. We didn't experience very much segregation. And it turns out to Bolsonaro, where you have this hyper masculinity and this misogyny coming up, and I didn't understand how does it take place. So it was like a couple of years that something turned before Bolsonaro was elected, and there is a missing link for me here. The same is on the question of political violence. Brazil is very violent, ever has been, but political violence, Brazilians only knew from the police, but not from the neighbors. I mean, you know what I mean.
Yeah. In the past, yeah.
So
Okay.
and that changed also. And the third area is connected to religion. Brazilian used to be a place where you have 120% of religion affiliation because people were affiliated to many churches at the same time, a very, very different religion. That seems to be different now when the evangelicals are playing the exclusivist role in the religion.
Okay.
So do you see one turning point, or do you see many, or is it gradual? How do you explain these changes from the 80s or early 90s and Bolsonaro's time?
Yeah, I haven't thought about it to be able to pinpoint a date. I don't know if I could, and I don't know if it's possible to do that. So religion, to start with. The evangelical Christians don't want people to be Catholic and Protestant, so they really push that, and they really push Catholicism is satanic and worshiping idols and things like that, and doing things that kind of violate the sensibility of the country, and have had problems with that. Like doing things on TV that have been violent to saints' images and things like that. But you're right. I mean, Brazil has had a religiosity since the colonial period, very deep. It's a Portuguese legacy, I think. It has to do with history of the Iberian Peninsula in many ways. They bring that religiosity. Afro-Brazilian enslaved people, religion is extremely important as a survival mechanism. And because of the ways in which the slave trade continued until 1851, abolition was only in 1888, there was a constant flow of new enslaved people into Brazil into the 19th century, which also brought West African religious traditions and spiritualities, and then new ones were created among Afro-Brazilian enslaved people and freed people. So that's a whole kind of thing. I think the rise of evangelical Christians and that kind of turn is clearly something of the 70s and the 80s. It's happening during the dictatorship, but it becomes more pronounced afterward. And that is partially a weakening of the Catholic Church and a space opening up, an ongoing intense situation of poverty and misery in which people look to forms of support, and governments prior to Lula's government really not carrying out serious combating inflation, which was very important under Cardozo, but not really developing nationwide social service programs that could attend to the millions of people who needed them. And that was something that made Lula incredibly popular when he developed kind of a transfer of money through what's called the Bolsa Familia, the family stipend, which provides a minimum amount of money to families to survive, and it's been determinative in their life. So that's the first question. That was gender. Brazil is strong tradition of gender hierarchy, and women only get the right to divorce in 1979, 78, and traditional patriarchy. It's a country that is extremely. Brazil has a stereotype about being open and fun-loving because of Carnival, and because Brazilians, as a people, are very warm people in general. Although I know a lot of unwarm Brazilians. But so they have that, but it's also extremely conservative society. The Catholicism was extremely conservative. That family is a very important part of the society, has been essential. And so all those things reproduce traditional gender roles. And although in the 60s, you see among middle-class women access to the universities and moving into the workplace, although working-class women had been always in the workplace and suffering and being exploited over centuries, you see more women assuming kind of middle-class professional jobs and occupations and pushing the feminist movement and making strides in that way. And I don't know what would be the date that one could mark when there's kind of a switch. The third question of masculinity, which you talked about in Bolsonaro, is what also Trump just did brilliantly in this campaign, which is developing on the anxieties that young men especially feel when they're feeling powerless in society. And in Brazil, during the Lula governments and the Dilma government in the very beginning, there was a tremendous amount of consumerism. People had access to consumer products that they never had in their lives. And then as violence and crime increased at the end of this period and the economy crashed, a lot of people had their cell phones stolen. My cell phone has been stolen. Their tennis shoes stolen, their Ray-Ban, their scooters, and started feeling really angry about the society around them. And a lot of these were guys who got their first motorcycle or got their cool tennis shoes or their Ray-Ban and were very happy about that, and they get ripped off from some other person in their community or in another community, and they're angry about this. And so the law and order discourse of Bolsonaro becomes really important in that regard, not just among male young people, but in general, the middle class is very concerned about the violence in the society. And the violence in the society really steeps up when people in Europe and the United States start consuming wide-scale amounts of cocaine, which passes from Bolivia and Peru through Brazil to Africa, Europe, and the United States. And, billions of dollars flowing through working class communities. And it's like, I'm going to work a minimum wage job and earn $600 a month or less, or I'm going to be a runner for the gangs. I might die in 2 or 3 years, but I'm going to make a lot of money, can buy a lot of tennis shoes in those 3 years. And so there's the violence has been the response by the police, which is come in indiscriminately, kill anyone in their way, do racial profiling all the time, and the disputes between the different gangs about who has dominance of the communities, which are places in which the drug flow happens. And so these are deep problems that had been there before in the violence of what is that you cannot have an institution of slavery for 300 years and not have institutional violence against people. So people of color have always been treated in a different way than other people. What was striking about the dictatorship is middle-class kids got arrested and tortured. And that was shocking to the elites of the country because their sons and daughters were getting the treatment that ordinary, mostly black people had experienced all their lives. And I think there's been a real understanding about that among sectors of the left now to address that question today. But it's a deep problem that the country has. And I don't have any solutions.
We have time for one more question. Oh my gosh.
How to choose.
Um,
You know what they do in Brazil? 3 people ask, and then I answer.
you get to
a block.
choose which one?
No, a block.
Oh, okay.
Do a block.
Well, all right,
I'll be
let's-
short.
Really short. So, David, how about you first, and we'll go in the back. Sure. Yeah.
Thanks for this great talk. My question also had to do with the articulation of a generation. As you mentioned, the generation of 1968 is articulated through international youth movements. What about international movements, particularly within Latin America, would help explain the protest movement in this particular generation?
That's one.
This isn't going to transition well from that. You mentioned that you would like to take one of the biographies that you've learned and turn that into an opera. And I was wondering what will be the melodramatic final scene of that opera.
Oh.
Maybe it's a Sarah Bernhardt.
You have to go to the Staatsoper. You have to go to the Staatsoper to see it, but I'll give a teaser on it. Thank you for asking that question. Mona was supposed to.
Okay, so
she didn't.
the music guy doesn't ask a music question. Another one does. All right, go ahead.
Hello, hi. Thanks for the presentation. It was fascinating. I'm from Bangladesh, and I am asking you, like,
You're from where?
Bangladesh.
Bangladesh. Okay.
Yeah, more of a global perspective. I was wondering, like, I used to know Brazil is a very open society from our perspective, from that much far. My question is more about regarding the BRICS, like from Brazil, like how do they balance the US involvement and the BRICS in the other way, and how the youth people in Brazil support this involvement being with Russia and China, who actually maintain is a very conservative way their society and repression of some communities in their soil. What is the say of the Brazilian youth today regarding joining the BRICS,
Right.
per se?
That's it, because I have 3 minutes. Okay. The first question, remind me, was
No, the first question was David.
David. I
Youth
know, but
groups.
tell me the first. Oh, the generation influences. Okay. So actually, it's John Lennon, not Vladimir Lenin. That's important. It's international rock culture. People are. It's complicated, but there's a nationalist ethos of the 60s that you need to only listen to Brazilian popular music, which is talking about the working class and the peasants and the poor and all these. And people say, no, I like rock and roll. In fact, there's even in the midst of the dictatorship, a march against the electric guitar by sectors of the left, organized by a very famous singer who thinks that the electric guitar is going to destroy Brazilian popular music. And they lose that debate. So it's circulation of, it's what didn't happen fully in 68 that starts happening in the 70s in Brazil. That is the counterculture, hippies, alternative music, and other things that are influential in a feeling of we need to be open. We can smoke, we can be a revolutionary, we can smoke grass, for example. That's not a problem. Whereas in 68, no, you can't smoke because that would be a security risk to our organization, et cetera. So that's a very simplistic answer to that question. The opera is about Marcos Arruda. It's the dramatic scene in the second act in the prison is when he is turned in by, he helps a woman try to find a place to hide. And she is arrested and tortured and gives his name because he knows nothing about her organization. And so he gets tortured, almost killed. And while they're in prison, he's in his cell, have been tortured. And she communicates with him through an electric outlet and begs forgiveness for having done that and feels horrible and guilty. And it's going to be an amazing scene. I don't write music, but I can imagine what it's going to be. And the ending is going to be a surprise. Yeah, because it's not fully the ending yet. We're debating it among the different people working on the libretto and things like that. So BRICS, very complicated. I'll say I can do it in 1 minute. BRICS was invented by an economist to describe Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and then they added on South Africa as kind of emerging economies. And so it was a construct of investment people talking about emerging economies. And then sectors of the BRIC nations realized that this was a possibility of articulating a multipolar alternative to the United States. And so and then in the last BRICS, people wanted to open it up to many more countries. And that's placed in Brazil's case a possibility if they were a player, because there were only 5, and if there are 20 countries in it, they're less of an important player. And also, they don't want to break with the West or the United States while they want to have open relations with China, Russia, and other countries. And I think that's a very complex tightrope that Brazilian diplomats are carrying out right now to how to do that, how to play that balancing act, almost like during the Cold War, Brazil tried to do that, to be equidistant between the East and the West. It didn't really work out very well. So I think that's what they're trying to do. It's a long tradition within the foreign services policies, and it has a lot of obvious contradictions. One of them, which I mentioned, was the debate around the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. When one sector of the left is totally in favor of the invasion, others absolutely against it. And it's a very interesting discussion that's taking place. Thank you.
Amazing. Well, it's kind of volcanic in your presentation.
I taught for 30 years, and the bell rings at the end of class.